Kate Chopin is a writer shaped by a nation undergoing rapid, tumultuous change. She was born just before the Civil War and was raised in a city divided between North and South. And she wrote during the rise of a shifting, growing women's rights movement. As both an Irish American and a French Creole woman, she stood at the intersection of multiple identities and shifting cultural expectations. Her fiction likewise captures women on the cusp of change. Characters who, like Louise Mallard in The Story of an Hour and Edna Pontellier in The Awakening, characters who, like Chopin herself, find themselves awakening to new realizations about themselves, love, freedom, marriage, motherhood. And some of these realizations resonated deeply with readers, making her quite the successful author. And some of these awakenings that her characters experienced proved deeply controversial. And the publication of The Awakening was virtually the end of her career and could have been the end of her legacy if it had not been resurrected once more in the 1950s and has since then been heralded as a monumental work of women's literature. Sadly, Chopin died about 5 years just after The Awakening's publication at the age of only 54. And so she didn't live to see the full impact that her novel would have. And so to better understand the characters she's created and their deep inner lives, we'll take a little bit of time here to explore Chopin's life and the legacy that she has left behind. She was born Catherine, aka Kate O'Flaherty, in Missouri in 1850, to Thomas O'Flaherty, an Irish immigrant businessman, and Eliza Ferris, the daughter of a French Creole family. As the Kate Chopin International Society biography notes, Kate was bilingual and bicultural, feeling at home in different communities with quite different values, and the influence of French life and literature on her thinking is noticeable throughout her fiction. Now, Kate was the third of 5 children, but the only one to survive beyond young adulthood. Her sisters all died in infancy, and her older half-brothers from her father's first marriage passed away in their 20s. But even before that, when Kate was just 5 years old, her father was killed in a train accident, and she was brought home from the boarding school she attended to live with her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. 3 generations of widowed women who became widowed quite young and never remarried. And so she was raised in a home notably absent of married couples until she was 16, and this field of female influence certainly had a strong impact on her sense of identity and independence. These women, particularly her great-grandmother, played a defining role in shaping her intellect and her worldview. Victoria herself descended from a lineage of trailblazing women, including her own mother, who was the first woman in St. Louis to obtain a legal separation from her husband as divorce laws were evolving, and became the owner of a shipping business, also something quite rare for a woman to do. And Victoria provided her great-granddaughter rather, with a rich education in French, music, storytelling, and surrounded by these independent, educated, and still socially astute women who wanted Kate to be able to navigate society successfully. She absorbed a blend of culture, resilience, intellect, independence, curiosity that we see throughout her life and her fiction. She pushes the boundaries of what a woman was expected to write and how she was expected to live. Her education continued at the Academy of the Sacred Heart, a Catholic boarding school for young women known for academic rigor and progressive instruction. While she was there, she excelled in her studies. She won academic honors. She was known for her sharp wit, apparently her talent at impressions, and she gave the commencement address at her graduation. She flourished under the mentorship of a woman named Mary O'Meara, who encouraged her to write and reflect and conduct herself valiantly. And we'll see what maybe that might mean to Chopin in her life and in her writing. So from an early age into her young adulthood, Chopin was nurtured and intellectually supported and challenged by the women in her life. And this is a foundation that is central to her voice as a writer and the themes that emerge in her work. According to one of her biographers, Peggy Skaggs, growing up in a household run entirely by women and receiving instruction from educated, independent nuns, unmarried women, in these visible positions of authority, didn't prepare Chopin to accept completely the limitations on a woman's autonomy that traditionally accompanied wifehood. But nonetheless, the expectation from her family, from her mother and grandmothers, was still that she would marry well and be taken care of. And ultimately, the education she received at the Sacred Heart Academy also emphasized the kinds of accomplishments that would attract a husband, except now instead of the angel of the house of Victorian England, we are looking at the debutante season of the American South. After graduating, Kate entered St. Louis' social scene as a debutante. At 18, she was described as an Irish beauty, according to her friend Kitty, and also she said that Chopin had a droll gift of mimicry. She was good at imitations and was known for her passion for music. And though Chopin participated in the usual round of balls, teas, and concerts, she also seems to have found the ritual of it all tedious and unfulfilling, writing cynically in her diary about the art of flirtation. Just keep asking, what do you think? As she talked to gentleman after gentleman. But the season nonetheless resulted in her engagement to Oscar Chopin. So here's where she moves from Kate O'Flaherty to Kate Chopin. He was the son of a Creole plantation family in Louisiana, and they married in 1870. And by all accounts, she was excited about this marriage. She wrote in her diary, "I am going to be married to the right man. It does not seem strange as I thought it would. I feel perfectly calm, perfectly collected." And how surprised everyone was, for I had kept it so secret. And so the couple honeymooned in Europe and then came back and settled in New Orleans, where Oscar worked in business and Kate gave birth to 6 children over the course of 9 years. And we don't have any accounts during this period that she was unhappy as a wife or mother. And what accounts we do have suggest she was affectionate, engaged, attentive to her children and her husband, but she also maintained what was considered an unusual degree of personal freedom for a woman of her time and class. She read widely, attended operas without the accompaniment of her husband, and unconventionally, for the period, smoked cigarettes and strolled the streets of New Orleans alone, people watching, basically studying what would later become characters in her stories. And this behavior might not seem terribly outlandish to us, but it was to some of the locals' chagrin that she was as outspoken as she was. Her style of fashion was apparently a little bit eccentric, and some found her charming. She remained socially popular, but there was sometimes an eyebrow raise over her independent streak. But rather than fading with marriage, it seemed to only increase. Even before her wedding, Chopin had begun to question some of the social assumptions around her culturally. She was drawn to bold women who maintained their individuality despite marriage, particularly a German actress and singer that she had met in New Orleans, whose example had left a lasting impression on her, a woman who maintained her career after marriage, which was a rarity. At home, Chopin's interest in music and literature continued to thrive. She had, at the age of 19, written her first story, though it went unpublished. And even with young children at home, she kept up this cultural, intellectual, private, and social life. So her marriage seemed to allow for a balance of domestic convention, fulfilling the role of wife and mother while still maintaining a personal autonomy. And this is a struggle that a lot of her characters inhabit in her later fiction, which has caused some critics to wonder, looking backwards, if her marriage was as idyllic as it might seem. And that brings us to Oscar Chopin himself. Oscar Chopin has a rather complicated legacy, and one that Kate Chopin is herself entangled in. Though Oscar had reportedly distanced himself from his abusive, slave-owning father, a man who was known particularly for his cruelty to his wife and his slaves, Oscar also joined the White League, a white supremacist paramilitary group that violently opposed Reconstruction and the legal rights of freed Black Americans. And he participated in the 1874 Battle of Liberty Palace, or Liberty Place, rather. This is when he and Kate were married. And this was a deadly insurrection in New Orleans that left dozens killed or wounded in a bid to overthrow the city's biracial government. And Kate herself grew up in a household that had owned slaves, and she lived through the Civil War in a divided border state. In Louisiana, there were Union and Confederate soldiers in a very uneasy coexistence. Her friend Kitty, who I mentioned earlier, was of a family who continued to support slavery and escaped Louisiana for some time. And eventually Kitty joined a convent to become a nun. Kate's own half-brother was a Confederate soldier who was captured and then later died of typhoid fever. Now, where does Kate fit into all of this? Growing up in the antebellum and postbellum South, surrounded by family, spouse, who have ties to slavery and white supremacy. These are questions that scholars have pondered and rarely found concrete answers for, but they are important to raise. We have no explicit record of Kate's own personal views on slavery or Reconstruction politics or the lives and rights of Black Americans. What we do have is her stories, and her fiction reveals a thoughtful, if complicated, engagement with race and social hierarchy in this post-emancipation South. In The Awakening, you'll see that Black characters appear only in the margins, nameless, largely voiceless, identified by their role as servants. But in several of her short stories, Black characters are given more space, more depth, and perhaps more personhood than any of Chopin's relatives, were they living, might have expected. In the story Ozeme's Holiday, the titular character Ozeme, who is a racially ambiguous Creole man, he may be white, he may be a person of color, but seems to at least be white passing. In the story, he's on his holiday, and it is disrupted when he stops to help a Black woman named Tildy harvest cotton while her son is bedridden. And yet Ozeme conceals this deed upon returning home, unwilling, filled with some kind of nameless, quiet shame that he won't speak of the aid that he gave to a former enslaved person. Why is this? Critic Barbara Ewell argues that in this story we see a reluctant kindness born out of a persistent cultural taboo in postbellum Louisiana, where interracial empathy is growing in some corners and still being furiously stamped out in others. Ozeme is, if anything, a character of quiet compassion, but not courage. The story makes no large, loud statement. Her story, Desiree's Baby, on the other hand, is a much more pointed critique of racism. I don't want to spoil the story too much because it is one I would like us to read, even though it wasn't originally on the syllabus. It is quite short, it's just a few pages. But the story deals with the unexpected revelation of what was referred to as miscegenation, which in and of itself refers only to relationship or reproduction between people of two different races, but in this period was used specifically to refer to typically a fear of mixing races and mixing bloodlines. And that fear in the story turns to anger, turns to tragedy, with some twists along the way. And it is clear in the story's unfolding that the fear of and the rejection of a biracial child is deplorable, destructive, and analogous to other forms of oppression. And so I'll leave it there and leave it vague because I would like us to read it. But it is, of all of Chopin's stories, one that engages most clearly and sympathetically with Black lives. It is not unique in its tragedy, as many of Chopin's characters for whom she feels the most affinity typically meet tragic ends. And so we'll take a closer look at that next week. But I raise all of this to put into context this question of Chopin's marriage to Oscar Chopin and whether she shared any of his beliefs Whether that was something acknowledged within their marriage, a point of contention within their marriage, we don't know. It is something that is unsettling to think that an author we are studying, who in many ways is quite progressive for women's rights and lives, could have shared these same beliefs as her husband and some of her family. And this is why it's vital that we read the work of writers like Sojourner Truth, who speak to that space in between the movement for rights for African American men and rights for white women predominantly. And we'll continue to see the voices that come after as we study the works of Black American writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison, and Audre Lorde as we move further into the 20th century. With Chopin, we have no easy answers, but what we do see is after her husband's death and her mother's death, her fiction explores questions of race, racism, and in Desiree's Baby, particularly that confluence between gender and race and oppression. And with that, let's return to Oscar and his relatively early death that would set Chopin out of this marriage and into a very different path that she chooses for herself. Oscar was not the savviest of businessmen, and his financial troubles deepened during their years in New Orleans, and this ultimately forced the family to relocate to his rural hometown of Cloutierville. There, he attempted to manage a general store, and while Kate, now a mother of 6, worked to adapt to the slower rhythms of country life, removed from the more cultural, urbane life that she had. Here she rode horses flamboyantly through town in colorful jockey outfits and continued to go on independent walks, drawing amusement and gossip from the locals. But this life in Cloutierville was short-lived. And the winter of 1882, Oscar died suddenly of malaria, and he left 32-year-old Kate with 6 children and significant debt, approximately hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's economy. This was at once an emotionally devastating loss and a life-altering financial catastrophe. To be a widow with 6 children, inheriting an enormous debt, and not a lot of career options ahead of you makes for a challenging situation. But Chopin demonstrates a strength and resolve. She does her best to settle her husband's affairs, sells off property, pays down his debts, and takes over the general store, though that was met with some consternation from some of the locals. What aroused even more gossip, however, was Chopin's decision to become entangled in a controversial romance with Albert Sampite, a married man known throughout town for his flirtations and affairs, especially with widows. And these two, they shared an attraction. They apparently had much in common. And he even helped Chopin collect on debts and manage the remnants of Oscar's estate. But nonetheless, he was a married man. And the affair ultimately ended. Whether it was due to this scandal, self-preservation, emotional disillusionment, or just the financial difficulties of surviving, Chopin made the decision to leave to live with her mother, bringing along with her her 6 children. Kate now faced the reality of widowhood, without wealth, without a profession, and no clear path forward. She was intelligent, well-read, but like many middle-class women at the time, there were still fewer options for respectable work that could support a large family. Teaching, sewing, clerical work, these were possibilities, but they offered little flexibility for a mother with children still at home, and not a lot of income either. But writing, that is an art that could be practiced at home and sold for modest, potentially steady pay if you learn to navigate the market, and it offered creative expression as well as financial survival. So what began as a rather pragmatic effort to earn a living by writing stories and articles and poems became the calling of Chopin's life. So drawing from her experience in New Orleans and Cloutierville, as well as the tensions that she had long observed and lived between women's private desires and public roles, Chopin began to publish stories in regional magazines and national periodicals alike. Her subjects were Creole families, Cajun laborers, Black freed people, lonely widows, rebellious wives. They were all drawn from life, but treated with psychological nuance that brings us to return to her stories today. Now, Chopin's entrance into this literary world is notably different from some of the other writers we've studied recently, namely Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Charlotte Bronte, 2 women whose ambitions were, at least initially, met with resistance or outright dismissal. Gilman, as you learned recently in reading The Yellow Wallpaper, was told by her doctor to stop writing entirely as part of the rest cure prescribed to her for her mental health. She later, in her essay, Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, said that he told her to never touch pen, brush, or pencil again in order to recover her sanity, but instead she writes, both in the article and in the semi-autobiographical story, that this is precisely what drove her nearly into collapse. It's an experience that she transformed into fiction as both a critique of this treatment of women and of their mental health, and perhaps as a form of recovery. The Yellow Wallpaper was published not that many years before The Awakening. Charlotte Bronte, on the other hand, publishing decades earlier, still faced perhaps a subtler but no less striking and impactful discouragements. When she was 20, she wrote to poet laureate at the time, Robert Southey, and shared with him some of her poetry. And this was before she had published Jane Eyre, before she had written it, presumably. And he replied saying that while she was talented, she had what he called the faculty of verse. He advised her that literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be. And in this letter, his assumption that a woman's true fulfillment should come from domestic duty and not the pursuit of writing, art, something that she chooses for herself, that's the very kind of notion that we saw Bronte challenge in Jane Eyre, as we saw Jane asserting that women, like men, suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, and need exercise for their faculties. This same need for intellectual and creative fulfillment drives Edna Pontellier in The Awakening. And you'll see that she finds in painting a means of expressing something more than the roles of wife and mother as they existed in her time and culture seem to allow for. But notably, unlike Bronte and Gilman, Chopin found unexpected support, perhaps, from a man. Her physician and friend, Dr. Friedrich Kolbenheimer, encouraged her to write after her mother's death in 1885. This loss, following not long after the death of her husband and her having relocated herself and her children to St. Louis, leaves her alone, still struggling with debts and raising her 6 kids alone. She is feeling isolated, depressed, angry. At just 34, she had lost every immediate family member, and she was navigating widowhood, grief, financial insecurity, all of it alone. And so writing became this emotional outlet while also one of the few respectable, reliable means to potentially eke out a living. Now, Kolbenheimer had been impressed with the literary quality of her letters that she had written to him when she was living in Cloutierville. And under his encouragement, Chopin turned those reflections of Louisiana life into short stories and essays that she sought to have published. This early work of hers drew heavily from her life in the South, and her voice, sharp, observant, descriptive, always looking closely at everything and everyone around her, quickly found a place in not just regional but national publications. And now, as Chopin's writing matured throughout the 1890s, her career flourished. I won't delve too deeply into this because the introduction in the text of The Awakening does discuss her literary career in more detail. But I will say that the fact that there was a growing audience for the kind of stories that Chopin wrote is significant and worth noting. These stories that centered upon women's lives, their inner lives, and how they questioned the conventional norms that circumscribed their public lives. Interestingly, these kinds of themes go all the way back to the short stories she first wrote at 19, just as she was approaching marriage. I don't believe it was ever published, certainly not when she wrote it. Posthumously, it was published. But it was called Emancipation, a Life Fable. And in it, she presents freedom as something dangerous but essential. The story was about a caged animal who chooses the perils of the unknown over the safety of captivity. And it's a fable. It's intended to have a layered meaning. This is a metaphor that becomes evident in her writing about women who often live in gilded cages, longing to be free, trying to navigate paths for themselves that may prove quite dangerous, socially speaking. Her stories feature women in search of independence, in search of identity and fulfillment. Some of them widows, some of them married, some of them spinsters. Some seek out affairs, some succeed, some suffer. Some pursue divorce, still a very controversial topic. Some avoid marriage, such as her character in Wiser Than a God, in which Paula refuses to marry in favor of her musical career. As we read The Story of an Hour, we'll get a look into a married woman's life when we pull back the curtain and see what is really inside her mind that no one else has been privy to. All of these stories of unhappy and sometimes happy marriages, women's pursuit of pleasure outside of marriage, taboo topics like divorce, alcoholism, deep inner lives, and messy emotions. These stories were quite popular, and Chopin's career flourished in the 1890s. She was a literary celebrity. She held weekly literary salons where everyone who's anyone would attend, a vibrant circle of artists and intellectuals. And while there were interested suitors, she chose to never marry again. Another biographer of Chopin, Emily Toth, has observed that few of Chopin's stories of widows are exactly steeped in grief. So whether or not Chopin had actually been content in her own marriage is unknowable. But the consistency and intensity of her critique of marriage as a limiting, even suffocating social contract suggests a deeper ambivalence than her early 19-year-old written diary entries would suggest when she was but a young debutante freshly married. But with the publication of The Awakening in 1899, we see the culmination of all of these themes that Chopin had been exploring, the height of her literary ambition, in a novel that is beautifully, artfully written. Even many of its critics would say that much, but it proved intensely controversial. I won't give much away as you are about to read it, but the novel follows the main character, Edna Pontellier, a young wife and mother in late 19th century New Orleans, and she slowly develops or awakens in herself a dissatisfaction with her domestic life. And this leads into a transformation as she becomes increasingly aware of her own desires, physical, intellectual, artistic, and begins to pursue them, breaking dramatically with the social codes of Victorian womanhood. Along the way, we will see other characters respond with varying levels of approval and approbation at her actions, and the novel itself provoked immediate outrage. Many critics condemned the story as immoral. The Nation magazine called it unpleasant. The Providence Sunday Journal referred to it as gilded dirt. And another prominent female author, Willa Cather, accused Chopin of squandering her talents on a trite and sordid theme. But even so, there was still praise for its artistry. The New York Times Book Review acknowledged her skill and expressed sympathies for the character of Edna, and this called the book sad and mad and bad, but consummate art. And more importantly, among women readers, particularly at the Wednesday Club, Chopin's work resonated deeply. Over 300 women came to hear her read from it and applauded her daring. But The Awakening was too radical for its time, and the backlash was swift and stifling. Her publisher declined to release her next short story collection, and major magazines in which she had been prominently featured stopped accepting her work. She continued to write stories, which we now have in our collection, stories that are now celebrated, like The Storm and Her Letters. But her literary career slowed significantly. This is why The Awakening endures, because it confronts the limited roles available to women and the consequences of what happens when they step out of socially inscribed roles. We see it in the character of Edna, and we see it in the life of Kate. The process of awakening to who you are and to seeing and reaching for the life you want is a theme that resounds throughout Chopin's work and finds its most deliberate and dangerous realization in the novel The Awakening. And as you read it, I want you to keep in mind something that Chopin wrote in her diary in 1894. It was just 5 years before the novel was published. And when she was reflecting on the loss of her mother and her husband, she wrote this, which I think is quite interesting. If it were possible for my husband and my mother to come back to earth, I feel that I would unhesitatingly give up everything that has come into my life since they left it and join my existence again with theirs. To do that, I would have to forget the past 10 years of my growth, my real growth. I think this is striking, this window into Chopin's own sense of how grief and love and independence coexist and often conflict. She recognizes that the life she built for herself as a writer, as an independent woman fully realized, would not have been possible had her husband lived, had her mother lived. The things she wrote about may not have been something she was brave enough to say. And these words anticipate a scene in The Awakening that I want to not spoil, hopefully, because you'll understand it more when you get to it. But there's a scene in which Edna is talking to her friend. She says that I would give up the unessential. I would give my money. I would give my life for my children. But I wouldn't give myself. I can't make it more clear. It's only something which I am beginning to comprehend, which is revealing itself to me. And to her friend, this is a deeply confusing statement. She says, but a woman who would give her life for her children could do no more than that. And that seems true, right? Edna says, I would give my life for my children. I would give up money. But those things, she says, are unessential. Money and life, those are nothing. Of course she would give them up for her children. But herself, that she cannot bear to give up. So what does she mean by that? That's what we'll read to find out. Because for Edna, just like for Chopin, what's at stake is not simply physical survival or being technically alive. It's the preservation of the self, that interior space where identity and passion and autonomy and agency reside. Edna, perhaps like Chopin, like so many other of her characters, begins to feel the erasure of that self in the service of others, even the ones that she loves. and she feels that it's a kind of death. Writing for Chopin becomes a way to reclaim herself. Chopin was able to have the life that maybe she dreamed of, or maybe she never did, but the life she writes for her character Edna, you'll have to read to find out what kind of life that is, and ask yourself, what does it mean to give up the unessential? Who decides what is essential in a woman's life? And how could a woman in this period balance duty to others with responsibility to herself? Readers both then and now of The Awakening are divided on how they feel about Edna as a character and the choices she makes throughout the novel, and their thoughts on the other characters who make up the pages of this book as well. Some admire her honesty, her courage, her independence. Others see her as selfish or silly or naive or any number of other things, immoral, unlikable. That kind of tension is what makes the novel such a compelling psychological portrait of a woman who is poised right at the threshold of the modern era, about to tip into the 20th century as she wrestles with questions about who she is and what place she has in the world, and if she can make space for herself and her wants and needs. After the publication of The Awakening, Chopin wrote only a few more short stories, and just maybe one or two were published, no longer in national famous magazines. And she pays a price for publishing this story. And literary scholar Lazar Ziff, I think, describes this in an interesting way. She says that Chopin learned that her society would not tolerate her questioning. Her tortured silence as the new century arrived was a loss to American letters. She was alive when the 20th century began, but she had been struck mute by a society fearful in the face of an uncertain dawn. Now, what we make of that silence, of the cost of asking difficult questions, of proffering controversial answers or possibilities, of pushing against boundaries, that's up to each one of us as readers. So as you move through The Awakening, consider not just what Edna does, but why she does it, and how Chopin invites us to sit with discomfort, confusion, ambiguity, beauty, all at once. In this story, we see a woman who Chopin describes as becoming herself and daily casting aside that fictitious self which we assume like a garment with which to appear before the world, and tells us that Edna, even as a child, she had lived her own small life within herself. At a very early period, she had apprehended instinctively the dual life, that outward existence which conforms, the inward life which questions. What kinds of questions does Edna raise, does Chopin raise about the life of a woman in 1899? What answers are we given, if any? And do we find them satisfying? Well, there's no time like the present to find out, so let's dive into the story of an hour, and then the story of The Awakening.